Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre, with me is Z, and this will be our last podcast of 2024. We are going to be taking a 2-week break for Christmas and the holidays. So, for those of you who listen around that time, happy holidays, and we will see you in the new year. So,
Yeah, have any plans for the holidays? Anything exciting going on?
not anything too exciting. Taking it a bit easy this year. I had considered going to CCC, but again, the ticket sales were pretty late and everything. And where I had just gone to Amsterdam in October, I was like, I'm good for conferences for a little bit. So
Yeah, the logistics on CCC. I don't know. I guess
I
last time I
really wish they would
attended.
move it. I really do. They seem hell bent on not moving it though.
Yeah, there's a lot of history on that. Yeah, I don't know because the last time I went, I was there as a speaker, so like I didn't have to worry too much about the logistics. Work was paying my hotel, and so I had a guaranteed ticket, of course. Since I was speaking,
Yeah.
so yeah, I don't know. Now that I paid a bit more attention, especially after COVID, I just see a lot of logistical challenges with trying to choose that as a conference, along with the fact that I'm usually kind of occupied during that same period doing some volunteer work for a New Year's event. Uh,
Yeah, it's one of those things where one of the nice things about CCC is where the ticket price is cheap. In theory, it's easier to commit to it. But the problem is when you're like us and you're in North America and it's like an 11-hour flight and you have to book like, $300-400 hotel rooms a night, it becomes a lot more of a commitment. Like if I was in Europe, it would be a lot easier to say, yeah, let's go to CCC. But from from Canada, it's difficult to commit to that around the holidays, especially.
on the
Uh,
logistics around the ticket sales too.
Yeah, because
Like,
you're not even sure if you're going to be able to get a ticket necessarily unless you have like connections with people that are able to get in on some of the rounds and are able to sell you some tickets that they got. But
yeah,
yeah,
like
the way they do
that's
their like ticket sale rounds, it's not like if you're on your own, like it might be tough to actually secure a ticket.
yeah, that's kind of the thing that gets me with it. And because if I'm going to book the flight, I'd rather have booked it out well before the tickets even went up for sale. So yeah, because I think I thought a little bit about CCC. I wasn't too serious about it because it was so late, but during the summer, during like the DEF CON thing, like, oh, maybe it would be fun to hit CCC again. And yeah, it as you realize, how you're definitely not guaranteed the ticket and stuff. I kind of backed off on that, but
The last time you went to CCC, you went for like a day or something, right? You weren't
yeah,
even there
well,
for long.
and I had intended to be there a little bit longer, but I ended up getting held up in. So one, the flight for me to get out there was only every once a day. So I ended up getting held up in U.S. Customs for flight was delayed, plus getting held in customs for an extra period of time meant that I just missed my flight, my connection that was already a little bit tight. So I got delayed an entire 24 hours, missing that part of the conference. And then I had to get back because I was still trying to do some of my volunteer work and just missed a couple days of that. So yeah, I was only there like the flight staff recognized me when I got on to come back. It's like, were you just on our flight? Like coming out, same staff.
That's hilarious.
So yeah, it was a fun experience nonetheless, but it was a very tight schedule for me that time. It was a great con experience though. Like I genuinely liked that con. It's been one of my favorite conferences,
It's
despite kind of my
great.
challenges.
It's great for like meeting up with people and collaborating with them on stuff because of like their whole like spaces idea. It's a pretty different conference from the way a lot of other ones are run. It's more of like a get together, so to speak. Kind of like DEF CON, but you actually have like spaces to work on stuff instead of like having to work in hotel rooms.
You actually can meet up with people at it, and
Yeah.
there's just the audience is different. Like it does have that more. I don't necessarily want to say hacktivist, but like it does have more that vibe.
Yeah, because of the interesting history, as you kind of alluded to earlier, of CCC.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's something I'm hoping to go to again one day, especially where like a lot of people that I know go to it, but yeah, not this year. So this year's holiday plans are just the typical boring family stuff. So
Yeah, I'm kind of planning, I think, to take it a bit easy this holiday season myself. I'm actually might not even be doing all of the same volunteer work that I was just alluding to.
Uh
Take
just
a bit of a break.
Yeah, because you've been doing that for how long have you been doing that volunteer work for? It's been like over 10 years or something, right?
It probably, I don't know exactly. I first got connected with the organization back in 2011. I definitely wasn't helping out with the event just yet, but I feel like I might be right on the 10 years. Although during COVID, I didn't help it. I don't even think it ran like on in 2020.
Uh
Uh, because I mean, a big event where we get a bunch of people together in a small environment during COVID just wasn't the
Bad
wisest
idea.
idea. Yeah. So I don't think it ran that here, but yeah, I've been working with it. At least I've had some involvement probably for 10 years, maybe 9. That was right around when I moved back to Canada where I was able to, or no, I guess because I would have been involved a bit before that too. Uh because that was I when I also had the CCC stuff. Yeah, I don't know. It's been a while and it
Around
takes
10
its
years is
toll.
probably a fair estimate, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really matter. It takes its toll, and I'm kind of feeling like I might just want to chill for one of these New Year's instead of always, being up until like 6 a.m. dealing with all the tech stuff there.
Yeah, that's totally fair. So, yeah, I guess we can get into some of our topics. We have a bit of an interesting one to start with, and it's a HackerOne report. And it gaslights you a little bit because it looks like a legitimate report unless you actually like read through the code a little bit more and you go to the comments section. So this was one that you spotted, Z, and I'll let you get into it.
Yeah, well, definitely the comments are the interesting thing here. If you look at the report, it seems rather legitimate. They're calling out the weakness here is listed just classic buffer overflow, and they're calling out that because there is in the code that they're sharing here.
Maybe we should talk a little bit about the context of the report just for people who are listening. So
Sure.
this is a report in curl, just to clarify that. So someone submitted this report that the curl inet N2P function, which is used for like converting network structures to character addresses. So it supports both IPv4 and IPv6. And due to the nature of different sizes for IPv4 and IPv6 addresses, they reported there could be potential for buffer overflow on the destination for the address. The main thing that they're basing the report on here is the fact that stir copy is being used, which is kind of an infamously dangerous function. It doesn't have size checking. The problem is in the code, there is a size check directly above the stir copy call where they call strlen on the address and ensure that it doesn't exceed the size. And the report just kind of ignores that. And even when the curl staff and HackerOne staff come back and say, hey, like there's a size check here, the original reporter is adamant that like there's still a way to exploit this issue.
Yeah, and this report, as I was going to get into, looks like a really good report. Like it has a lot of the hallmarks of a pretty decent report. It does have a few things that I would be I would advise reporters against doing. So one of the things I would just call out, like when you're giving a report, or I guess, yeah, like when I read the impact, like when you're giving a report to curl, like I don't think you need to explain what like memory corruption is and what like a program crash. Like some of this stuff just feels like a little bit of knowing your audience and understanding like they're already well aware of things. This thing also mentions that like here's this proof of concept, you can run it, and if you run this with the address sanitizer, the compile instructions include using asan or address sanitizer with the GCC compiling it, and it will detect the overflow. Now, that's maybe a first red flag. I actually didn't notice this on my initial read through. I do notice they're compiling the test, or oh no, sorry, I just misread that as I was coming through now. Oh, so never mind what I was going to say as a red flag, but it does call out using ASAN. And so when they actually start trying to triage this, it's like, hey, thanks for the report. They take a look. It's like, hey, there's actually this check like right before the line that prevents this. Also, we ran this with ASAN. They also ran with Valgrind and weren't getting any error with it. So, like, what's up here? And since they also use the word risk of an issue, does that Badger mentions here, does that mean you can't point to a real security flaw on a specific line of curl code? And you get this response here that if you've ever used like ChatGPT, Anthropic system, if you've used those AI, the large language models, you've talked to them and you've tried to correct them, this should read very familiarly. Because this is basically seems like an AI response. Thank you for your feedback. You're right. That check is there. And, basically agreeing with the person correcting them. And what it comes down to is this is probably just somebody using AI bot. They got a vulnerability, but not only are they giving a vulnerability report generated by the AI, and which hallucinated like being able to get this with ASAN and stuff, but then they're also interacting with all of the comments back to the staff here with more just AI response, showing like they don't necessarily even understand the issue. They're just, what does AI say and handing it back. I find it funny when they get this response there after it's like, oh, they start to recognize that this is probably AI. Badger calls out, I call slop or AI slop. And so they kind of get the response, which honestly, I wonder if this was maybe not automated, but it almost feels like if you typed in I call slop to like ChatGPT, this would actually be the type of response it would give you. Which, fun fact, if you're ever doing like prompt engineering, using little terms like, I call slop or, that was cringe is another one that's a little bit popular, can completely change how it'll get it to rewrite what it just did in in different ways. And so it almost feels like they might just literally taken that response and automatically try to reply to the staff with AI thing. I don't know if that's like for sure what happened here, but it feels like that might have been what happened. And anyway, ultimately, this comes down to this is just a case of AI being used to take up open source developer time, which shows complete disrespect for them that you're not even willing to. I get using AI to help you in doing the reports, but this genuinely seems like it is just AI generated all the way through this, and it's just complete disrespect for everybody's time, probably in hopes of getting some bounty, but
So
yeah.
while you were talking there, I actually took a look at the attachments, which I don't think you're easily going to be able to bring up, unfortunately. Um, but I got to thinking about it when you mentioned about address sanitization. It's like usually when you say that you can trigger an ASAN report, you include the ASAN report, and they did
Yes.
actually. So if you look at the attachment, it looks like a legitimate ASAN report. It goes into INET, NTUP for unsafe and whatever, and like it's all legitimate. The problem is if you download the POC attachment, you'll notice that they're not actually using curl at all. They implement INET and 2p4 as their own function and like calls for copy without any size checking. Like it almost emulates the curl code, but not actually the curl code because it doesn't have the check that the curl code does. So like it is a legitimate crash. It's just not against curl code. It's against their own code.
Okay.
So
I downloaded it, I've copied and pasted it so I can actually have this up and take a look because I did not take a look at the attachments on this one. So
yeah,
let's
I
see
just
here.
ought to do it while you were talking. But you can see like they have the static function for that they're crashing in, and it's in their code, not in curls.
Oh yeah.
And like this is the kind of thing again that I would kind of expect
Which
a AI bot to do is to
yeah,
like
and
generate this kind of code and demonstrate why it's unsafe.
yeah, and in fairness, that is I was trying to find a comment that I remember reading. Right, here's the comment. This is in the AI response, be like, yeah, we do this size check, so what's wrong here? And it kind of comes down, as it's explaining its thing and how, ASAN showed the issue. That being said, in cases where the check may be bypassed or in a different implementation scenario, similar vulnerabilities can still appear. Like this is also like somebody's using this. This is why I think it was also like possibly completely automated because if
There's a lot of
somebody
red
were reading
flags there.
this they should be able to realize that like this is not addressing the concerns of the person actually asking the question.
Yeah.
So it's either they don't understand it and so they're just acting as a proxy, or it's totally automated. Like I said, it's completely disrespectful. It is a terrible use for AI. Like AI can be used to help, but not like this. And I really want to call this out because maybe this has happened before. I've never seen like this direct of like clear AI, especially also when they turn around the individual there end up saying like, I understand you're upset, but let's keep this conversation respectful. If you need to discuss something, have to listen. But like they clearly aren't listening and they're not helping, but they are wasting time of the developers. And that's the thing, when it comes to your bug reports, you want to make it as easy for them to deal with the issue, to understand the issue and to deal with it. And
Yeah,
this sort of thing is excessive writing that just wastes time.
it's unfortunate because it doesn't only hurt like the curl developers in this instance, but stuff like this is why people don't want to run bug bounty programs and vuln research programs, and I think it puts off companies from running them. And when you have like, again, I talk about OLM in a bad light a lot, but the advent of like GPT and the accessibility into being able to do this stuff now means that these bug bounty reports, you can scale them up so much more by leveraging AI in this way, where before you would have to put some effort into actually making it look like a good report. Now you really don't.
Well,
Um,
let's not say that. There are a lot of bag bounty reports that don't look like good reports. It used to be kind of
okay,
obvious that they were bag bounty, whereas this
exactly. That's
lets
kind
it
of what
blend
I'm
in.
getting
Yeah.
at, is that it's easier to submit bug bounty reports that are a lot harder to triage as immediately being garbage. Um, and like I could see that, if that issue isn't addressed by like HackerOne, it probably should be something that HackerOne should be trying to address. I could see it scaring companies off of, like, into closing their programs if it becomes like a problem at scale.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of what some companies are paying HackerOne to do, is to do that initial triage before they
That's
need
true.
to invest time. I will mention it does seem like HackerOne may have deleted this person's account. It no longer appears if you try and access it. That could be that they deleted it because this did. So I found this report actually off of Hacker News, so it's possible that there's kind of that social media hug of death. Well, maybe not hug of death, that's maybe the wrong term to use for this case, but there is that there is perhaps that social media backlash also. I don't know that it was HackerOne. It did go straight to like a 404 page, not like banned or deleted, but I don't know what it would look like when an account does get deleted. So yeah,
Yeah,
it's
I
possible
will say,
they've taken
like,
something.
yeah, I mean, we've seen instances where like HackerOne seems to be pretty well moderated generally. So, hopefully like these kinds of reports aren't going to become commonplace. But yeah, it is kind of funny seeing like the red flags and just the complete lack of context that's on the researcher, in air quotes, side of things here.
Yeah, and I appreciate that Curl actually went through the effort to try and disclose this or to get it disclosed. I'm not
Yeah, and they
sure.
were, despite the original poster saying that they feel disrespected. I mean, they gave way more of a time of day to this than they probably deserved. Like,
Pearl's a good project. Like they actually
yeah,
take these things seriously. And we've kind of talked a few times about their bounty because they're very transparent and they're an
yeah,
interesting project with like, a lot of users. So no, they're a good project and this just kind of showcases that.
yeah, for sure. All right, so getting into some real problems, we have a Portswigger post this week, and it's about bypassing web app firewalls with the Phantom version cookie. So this goes into a bit of a history and background on cookies and some things about cookies that I didn't even know, because they're like old RFCs, legacy RFCs that maybe aren't supported by like all servers and browsers, but some of them do, and that can lead to some interesting differentials. I'll let Z take this one away.
Yeah, and that's kind of the key word here is differentials or parsing differences in terms of how, so as mentioned, like browsers generally aren't supporting these old RFCs anymore, but the server software very well may, or they may handle it differently depending on what you're sending. So it can still open up an attack avenue for like you sending some sort of malicious request that gets a cookie parsed maybe incorrectly or at least differently. The web application firewall may interpret the cookie differently than everything else or not interpret it correctly and all of that, which is kind of where this comes down to. It comes down to kind of an old cookie format where, or at least the main thing this one focuses on, it sounds like they're going to do a bit more of a series about cookie issues. And so this is just kind of the first and what will probably be a series. And they're mostly talking about this version attribute being included. So what happened in like 2011-ish with an RFC is they introduced kind of an attempt. You'll also notice this cookie maybe looks a little bit different than you're used to. And actually, I said 2011. Was that? Sorry. It ended in 2011. It was obsoleted in 2011, but existed kind of, between 1997, it seems like, according to this one at least, this RFC, and was finally obsoleted around that 2011 point. And you might notice this cookie, looks familiar, but also not. You've got this $sign before the path and domain, and you've got this version thing at the start. So what kind of happened is they tried to differentiate just the cookie values, kind of prevent spoofing by using this $sign as a way of like demarcating these as like attributes. And so you have like the path and domain, which are attributes you'd recognize from normal cookies, only $sign.
And the whole basis for that is the fact that you can't have special characters in like regular cookie names, right? That's kind of the thinking there.
So, I mean, the post itself gets into dealing with special characters. I couldn't tell you if the RFC actually says you can't do it, but like that is the idea, at least, that you'd use this to demarcate and you can actually prevent it. So at least with the $sign, I'm not sure what the actual spec said in terms of what the cookie names can
contain. Their quote does say that many HTTP header field values, and then it goes on to say these special characters must be in a quoted string to use within a parameter value. So I'm guessing
that's within
you can't
the parameter specifically.
Okay.
Within
so
the value,
that doesn't include the cookie name.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the cookie name specifically is, but the intent here, as I recall, it was about using it was to do what you're saying, to have some that shouldn't appear in the actual cookies as a way of indicating this is like a special control data, having some separation there. And so the one that they end up actually kind of focusing on here is this version, and that just came down to like there's kind of the Netscape cookies. Early internet was very much dominated with Netscape stuff. Not really a well-defined spec. I think there is a document about the Netscape version, but it was implied like cookies that didn't have a version were version 0 or Netscape, and then version 1 meant it was like this and adhering to this format. And of course, today you don't see it, and you're also not assuming that it's like Netscape cookies. We have kind of a newer spec, it's been superseded. But in some cases, they did find that they call out here with Apache Tomcat. So that is, they're looking at a Spring Boot Starter Web 2.x, and how it processes the cookies. It would actually know, like, oh, there's this version attribute there. If that's there, then we must use this legacy parsing. And so it goes into a completely different parser that includes unescaping / characters. So Tomcat's going to interpret these cookies and set up, it's still going to call like the code using the cookies normally, but it's going to have unescaped all this character that the web application firewall almost certainly or probably is not actually doing. They also call out like different separators, like the support for comma, which is now largely just being done with you'll see semicolons as more common separator today. And they use the example here of the Amazon Web Service firewall, where it's blocking like this eval test, but they can get around that using quotes. And then, because it is specifically, it's decoding inside of the quotes, I believe, only. I believe that's mentioned. I'm not seeing it right now, but you do see that they kind of use the quotes there. And so it kind of looks at that sort of differential and calls out a couple different things there. Kind of interesting set of vulnerabilities there. I am definitely looking forward to seeing more. And they do also call out 2 other posts. I believe we talked about one of these. I believe we did talk about the cookie bugs. I'm not sure on what episode of what been, but it came out May 5th, 2023. So it's possible that this was one that was kind of on our last episode before we took our long break that year and like didn't end up talking. I remember reading this and like it's a really solid document, more about some attributes and like using the prefixed cookies, or at least that was my takeaway from this one. It covers a bit more, but still at the end there's a couple links there to some good posts about just handling cookies in general. I mean, get both of these up just so they show up in our show notes. Worth a read if you're interested there. Honestly, like, it's easy enough to understand this issue as just being like bypassed because of this differential in parsing, support for the quoted strings, especially, meaning that they also get the escaped characters or unescaped characters. Genuinely, it's kind of starter research. It's like, oh, this is interesting to be aware of, but there isn't a lot to run with in terms of like, this is exactly where we've seen this vulnerability. Also, I didn't realize they had an official Discord, that there was a Portswigger Discord. I probably should have been aware of that. I don't think it's new, but I just never taken note of that. Or, watch this. I'm probably in it. Like, I just never go there because I'm in a lot of
40,
Discords.
Yeah, I'm in like 40 or 50 Discord servers. A lot of the time, I don't even know which ones I'm in beyond the ones I use every day. So,
yeah. I remember
totally
I'm in
the
some of them when somebody highlights me to be like, oh, Z, knows this or might be to help or something.
Yeah.
Either way, it's a solid post. It's an interesting thing. And I mean, there's so much with cookies, and there's been a bunch of research coming out lately about cookies. So there's kind of that long history there. It's like, this is certainly not the only issue. And like I said, I believe this is going to be, at the end here, they mentioned this blog post is the first part in their exploration of cookie parsing logic. And we'll look at how these can be used in the real world. So yeah, looking forward to seeing some more posts, but good start, pretty easy read, and just a fun issue.
Yeah, I mean, we've always liked the parser differential attacks because they typically have like some fun context attached to them where it's not a boilerplate exploit all the time. They can allow some really interesting research. So
yeah, we don't get a lot of that in this post. So like there is the differential
they
between
don't go
the
super deep
WAF,
on them,
yeah. But there's a lot of potential. Whenever you have those differentials, there's a lot of potential for some really fun bugs to exist there. And some kind of unexpected things just because they exist in that glue, that integration between systems rather than in the singular system itself.
for sure. We do have some operating system issues in the episode today. So our first one here is from Exodus Intelligence, and it's a Windows bug.
Jumping from web right into Windows kernel.
Yeah, it's a bit of a stark change, but that's just how it goes sometimes.
That said, I think there's still some takeaways from this one that will apply even if you're not doing like memory corruption.
Yeah. So this is a memory corruption bug. So it's a use after free in the afd.sys driver in Windows for Windows sockets, particularly this registered IO extension, which seems to be a bit newer. And that is basically an optimization thing to reduce the amount of context switching done when doing network heavy operations so that you can use sort of like a shared memory for sending and receiving requests so that you don't have to invoke as many syscalls. And to facilitate that, you register these IO buffers, which the driver is aware of, and there's various functionality for managing them. The vulnerability comes down to a race where they have two functions. They have this get and cache buffer function and dereference buffer. Dereference is a little bit of a misnomer, I think, because what it actually does is it's basically a free function. It'll check if the reference count hits 1. If it does, it'll call free. So the flip side of that is get and cache buffer. That's used to take a reference and it'll, increment the reference count. There's some other places that will also take a reference for a brief time to do some operation. And while the reference count changing is atomic, they don't seem to take ownership at all when they're managing the ref count. So just because the reference count is atomic doesn't really mean anything when you can have another CPU go in and enter that same code block. You can still have race condition issues. So this just seems to be like a bit of an immature code base, just not well secured against concurrency. Seems to be kind of a straightforward issue in that sense. It is a little bit interesting though, because when you have your initial primitive in this kind of functionality that's for creating like these IO buffers and doing shared memory operations, it makes for a really nice exploit typically. And it seems like that was the case here as well. They were able to just kind of, get a buffer sandwiched where they wanted it in the non-paged pool. They then triggered the use after free and just take over a what was it? Sorry, I'm just trying to find it. I thought I put it in my
It was
notes.
some MDL.
Right, yeah, it was an MDL, and then they could just directly go for like an arbitrary read primitive, arbitrary read write. So
Yeah, like it
yeah,
used the point. Like basically, they'd craft their own object. It was like it had already, because this is buffers that are meant to be read and written to, that it's wrapping.
you
They
kind of
could
have
just
the
set
primitives
that
built in
arbitrarily.
already.
Yeah, it had
Yeah.
very like super easy primitives for your read and write. At which point it's kind of game over in the kernel. Generally, you're just after editing some of the kernel's data and not actually like going for code execution there. You just want to say, oh yeah, I'm totally a system process.
Yeah, the token attacks are the like meta for Windows exploitation, which is exactly what they do. So yeah,
Yeah, and kind of the takeaway that I thought here when it comes to, if you're not doing the memory corruption stuff at a low level here, like a lot of this isn't going to apply, but there is still the idea of like freeing the object without actually grabbing the lock on it when it's a reference counted object. Like you're accessing that ref count, you're checking it, and you're doing that add, or you're, well, I guess you're not even subtracting on it. Did they? Because I don't think they call the subtract. I think they just go straight to free if it's one and they're freeing it. Oh,
yeah, I will say the code is a little bit weird there because like I've read a fair amount of kernel code that does this sort of reference tracking and automatic freeing and everything, and I've never seen it called dereference like that. And typically, like you say, it's doing both a decrement and a free if it reaches one, but it doesn't seem like that's what's happening here. So it's just sort of weird code, I guess.
yeah,
I don't know.
that was kind of the call that I'd want to make on this one. Is, one, just the locking, being aware of where things should be locked and like what type locking should exist when you're dealing with some of this. Maybe you're not going to run into that. Like this is, I guess, more of almost a code review thing. Although, I mean, Windows isn't really something you do direct code review on. You've got the reverse engineering layer, but in general, like locking is just hard to get right, and concurrency issues, I guess, just generally, really. Like this is a very kind of classic issue when it comes to anything reference counted, is that you kind of have just not actually holding locks or doing the counting incorrectly. Like having the primitives to access the counting is another kind of common bug.
Yeah, and I will say slightly surprising to see that being shipped in like a Windows driver nowadays because I know Microsoft's processes like they have a lot of internal fuzzing processes and everything, and this seems like a bug that should have been caught fairly easily, but it's always easy to overestimate how fuzzing can catch race conditions because you can get so many factors that just make them unreproducible unless you perfectly reconstruct an environment for it. So you know, I guess I shouldn't be super surprised, but yeah, this code seems a little bit weird and a little bit shakier than I would expect it to be. So maybe
Yeah,
it's
and they
harder to
don't
audit for more things.
talk at all about discovery here, I don't think.
No, I don't think Exodus Intel goes into that very often, if ever.
No, they
So
don't. I think it's come up, like, because they have a training on like vuln research, so like they do sometimes mention it, but yeah, a lot of times it's just the vuln or just and exploit.
yeah. And continuing on the Windows issues, we have another one. This one's by SSD Advisory. And again, sort of a classic bug. It is a integer overflow in the kernel streaming service and an unnamed ioctl. For those listening who can't see the code, pretty early on in this function, used by the handler called thunk enable event IRP, they take a user provided output buffer and a size, and they adjust the length of the buffer by aligning it. So they'll add like hex 17 and do the and stuff to align it. And well, yeah, that can just be overflowed to make the size a very small value. And then later on, when they go to a memmove call, they subtract 16 from that size and pass it as the length. So int overflow you can use an int overflow to get the value smaller than 16 and then cause an int underflow in the memmove call and trigger a large move. So sort of a classic issue. And in this case, it is exploitable, especially where it's in the kernel. They can just kind of set up user space memory in a way that the copy will run into unmapped memory to truncate the overflow. And they just leverage named pipes to get their arbitrary read primitive. And again, you're sort of going after that whole token and everything. So yeah, I mean, again, sort of a classic issue. It is kind of neat how you have the one int overflow leading to an int underflow later on. You sort of have that additional step in the process.
Kind of a fun little flip flop, if you will. You go from kind of both extremes.
Yeah. But again, a little bit surprising to see, whenever you see like math being done like that, especially alignment operations on lengths, it seems to be something that developers always struggle to do well. So
yeah, you wrote a CTF challenge based around that, didn't you?
I'm pretty sure I did. Yeah.
Yeah, back on 0x1 from. I couldn't tell you which one it was, but
Neither
I seem to recall you doing something with alignment in one of those challenges.
Yeah, it's a very like classic thing. And as a developer, it's sort of easy to look over it like, okay, yeah, you're getting it aligned because it has to be or whatever. That's fine. And then just kind of ignore it. And it's easy to ignore the implications of what doing that math can mean. But
yeah, you're focused on the happy path when you write a lot of code. You're thinking about what you want to do, not necessarily like the rest of it. And I will also mention where this was found, I think is kind of worth calling out. And might also be, why this kind of slips through. And that's because it's in like the translation process, basically. They call it here, there are some handlers to make the 32-bit process work properly on like the 64-bit system. And so it's kind of in that, or as I understand it, at least, like this is in that glue area. Kind of like the compatibility layer on Linux systems where you'll have a very similar thing. And so it's also kind of in that code that's easy to overlook because it's not the primary functionality. It kind of
it's not really being called into very often, especially nowadays. Like,
well, even if it's called into, like if you're going to really quickly look for the handler of something, you're probably going to go to like the bulk of the code where it's all complex and stuff, not necessarily this area.
Yeah, that's
I mean,
fair.
you end up there because it is the handler. Like you do end up there first, but the bulk kind of usually how it'll often work is you do kind of end up with this translation and this glue, and then you kind of end up in the bulk of the code where it's being called.
It's a wrapper,
like by both of them, yeah. And so those sort of areas just tend to get overlooked because they're usually relatively simple in terms of what they're doing. But bugs can still exist there. Those handlers, like, yeah, in this case, 32-bit, 64-bit, but you also have these handlers in places like in Python. You'll have these handlers in between the Python code when it calls into a native C library. You have that handler kind of doing a translation there. Those places don't necessarily get looked for bugs as much as just looking at the end result, but you can have things that exist in that glue. So, worth being aware of and digging into that glue code too.
Yeah. And while we have been talking about Windows, Linux isn't going to be left out of the fun. So our last topic is from the GitHub Security Lab and is a time of check, time of use issue in the Linux
this one's
kernel.
actually, from Google Security Research. It's on GitHub. It's a GitHub.
Oh, sorry.
It's a GHSA report.
Yeah, I saw the GHSA tag and that's where my mind went. But yeah, sorry, it's from Google. Yeah, so this was one of those funny bugs where it's a Linux kernel bug, but it impacts user space directly, more so than the kernel itself. So this was reported by Marco Venati. And again, pretty surprising bug because if there's one functionality in Linux that is used as like the core of Linux, it would be the exec functionality. You kind of expect it to be pretty well bug free at this point after decades.
Yeah, very battle tested.
Yeah, but I guess kind of proving that wrong is this report. And the core of the issue is pretty simple. It's just the fact that when you have like set UID binaries, the exec permissions are checked at a different time than the set user ID bit is applied, because the reload and check of the permission field isn't atomic. So as an example, they wrote a checker program, which would be a payload that gets ran as root. It just kind of spits out this message like, hey, I am root. And a root program then continuously loops and changes the permissions on the checker program. It'll set the set UID bit, and then it will set the execute and search permission bit. And
Sorry, so just to
times
be
when
clear there, it will remove the set UID bit and then set executable. So
sorry, yeah, yeah.
at no point is it going to be executable by the user and set UID.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
that's the
that's
intention.
yeah, that's the important thing because it's transitioning between these two safe states that they call out here. The binary can be, set UID as root, but not executable by the attacker, or it's not set UID but is executable. And both of those are safe. Either it's not going to escalate or it's not going to run. But in that transition, because it does the check at one point and then uses the set UID value at another, you end up, being able to race it. Yeah, it's a really fun bug, I think, because of that. Surprised that exists is a
Yeah.
very logical issue.
Yeah, it's not really memory corruption at all, even though its roots are like a race and like lack of atomics there. You will need something that can like do that mode switching for you as root, but they state that it is possible to actually do this in reality by using package managers. For example, in Debian, you can install or update the telnet login package and then race it to try to invoke it to get a root shell. So yeah, it's kind of cool that even though this scenario does require some conditions, it is actually still exploitable.
Yeah, like there are definitely some big asks on this one. Like the ability to install packages and like use the package manager is, of course, itself, usually something that you'd be sudoing for, but it's not that uncommon to actually have like sudo permissions to do some of those tasks.
But not be full root. Yeah.
Yeah. So like there's definitely a big ask because I mean the ability to just install arbitrary packages, that feels like that's a pretty big risk for somebody to have but not be root, but it can happen. And they kind of call that out as one example where this does happen, but it could happen elsewhere. It's an interesting bug. I do understand why it's been missed for all this time, because it is like a pretty big ask and a pretty rare situation already. But it's a cool bug nonetheless. Like it is a great find.
Yeah. And something we were talking a little bit about before the show was towards the end, they state that they did try testing this on FreeBSD and macOS, and it seems to be unaffected. And at first, that seems a little bit surprising because FreeBSD and Linux, while they are different operating systems, they do typically share a lot of similarities. And because of how like high level of a logic bug this is, you could definitely see this applying to other operating systems as well. But what I believe, and I haven't looked too deeply into this, so this is just my speculation, but I believe the reason that FreeBSD might not be susceptible to this, and kind of by extension macOS, because BSD and Apple, they have a history. There's an overlap there. FreeBSD started out with a very heavy focus on big kernel locks, so even though there was concurrency and everything, where the Linux kernel seems to have always kind of had this idea of, lock where we need to and then exit the lock state. Because if you hold the lock for a long time, that's going to be really bad for performance. FreeBSD was kind of like, nope, just lock everything. I think at one point they might have even had like the ioctl syscall or something as a big lock so that you could only run like one ioctl on a device at a time or something like that. It's not as performant, but it is a lot safer at securing you against these kinds of races and atomic type problems. So if I had to guess, that might be why FreeBSD isn't affected. Again, though, I haven't like done a deep look into the code to see, but that's probably what it is. And again, you're kind of seeing those trade-offs that you can have between like performance and security. That's a huge thing when you're talking about race conditions. And you can see how the different approaches can cause problems on either side.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting to know the difference there because they did go and test this. So I have not gone and looked at the FreeBSD code, but the fact they did go to try and test this because they do call out, the proof of concept binary just doesn't get executed. It makes me think that the code itself is very similar, which does kind of lend a bit more credence onto the idea that perhaps this is just the larger locking at play, um, causing a little bit of a defense here. Because I would guess before they tested this, they did take a look to see if like the XNU code looked similar when it came to exec or for that XNU for Mac OS maybe looked similar, and so they thought they'd give it a try and weren't able to exploit it. kind of lent some credence to the idea that could be locking, but yeah, we didn't double check that and actually take a look at the FreeBSD code to confirm that, but it does make sense, as you said. And yeah, it's just an interesting side effect of the difference in design philosophy.
Yeah. And as a final note, I'll say like it's a pretty good thing, I guess, that this vulnerability has that high ask where you need to be able to abuse like a package manager and have some level of permission. Because if this could be exploited from like a completely untrusted context, this would be pretty crazy. This would be one of those bugs that would hit like every distro. It's a core kernel bug. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that's why it, like, stood out when I saw like just scrolling through things, TOCTOU in exec system, like, and Linux kernel, like, it's that's a
It's
massive
pretty hard to
impact.
run it. Yeah, because it's pretty hard to run a Linux system without exec. It's not like you can just work around it by disabling the functionality. You won't have a computer anymore.
Yeah, and it's not something that gets modified a lot. Like, you don't have distros writing their own exec stuff or like making too much of a change there. So yeah, it's definitely one of those, lot of potential there. Definitely eye catching to see it, but realistically, there are some big asks for this one.
Yeah.
But
But
still,
yeah,
like I
with that
said,
said,
great find.
yeah, yeah,
It's
I
a
agree.
fun bug.
But yeah, that's pretty much all the topics we have. So unless you have anything to add, Z, we'll wrap it up there.
Yeah, no shout outs, but I hope everybody has a happy festive season or holiday season.
Yep, for sure. And hopefully it's not going to be like last year for me at least. Last year we had like all these family plans and everybody in the family got sick like 2 days before Christmas. So nothing happened last year. Everyone was just isolating last year, so hopefully that is not the case this year. But yeah. So as he said, happy holidays everyone and we will see you all in the new year.